Welcome back. We are continuing our study in the rhetorical analysis of the Bible. We've seen that as we observe, and then we chart, and then we look at grammar, and then we look at how individual words function in their basic meaning, and then we see how words together, put together, form a rhetorical line of thought. And so we have to look at each genre, identify the rules that go along with that genre. Like if we're looking at a poetic piece, we don't interpret it the same way we would a narrative. But if we're looking at a narrative, there are certain guidelines that would lead us to understanding that. Speaking of poetry as a genre, one of the aspects or one of the facets that are contained in poetry is, and in all rhetoric in that fact, is what's called figures of speech. And so today what we want to do is look at figures of speech, chiastic structuring, and parables. These are three, shall we say, unique and boilerplate techniques and tools that are used in rhetorical analysis. And without understanding how they work, we sometimes can find ourselves off in the weeds in terms of how to interpret the Bible. So we want to start with figures of speech, and if you would pull up your handout called Figures of Speech, how's that for originality? Pull that one up if you would. You know, it's baseball season somewhere around the world, and you know, there are a lot of different phrases that go with baseball. As you notice up on the screen, phrases like striking out, can't get to first base, backed against the wall, a big hit, covering all the bases, throws a curve, 3 strikes and you're out. I mean, these are, you know what these are. These are all ways of describing baseball. Except you also know that these are all figures of speech that can be used not only in baseball, but they can be then turned over and highlighted into some other field. Like in the midst of your life, somebody threw you a curveball. Somebody now feels like I'm really playing in the majors, or that person's Bush League. These are baseball sayings that are appropriated over into a different arena of life, and therefore they are functioning as a figure of speech. So let's look at figures of speech if we can. Sometimes a speaker or writer purposely sets aside the normal function of grammar to use peculiar forms that are different from their original or simplest meaning or use. If we say the ground needs rain, that's a normal plain statement. But if we say the ground is thirsty, we've expressed the same meaning but in an unusual, more colorful way. Sentences using figures of speech may not be true in their normal sense, but they still convey truth, though in a way that's not literally true to fact, but true to feeling. So if we're to look at the use of language and communication, we've seen this before. You can speak in ordinary language, it's cold, scientific language, it's 22 degrees with precipitation, or poetic language, it's raining cats and dogs. That's a figurative way, it's a figure of speech trying to make a point. We all know what all three of those mean, but they come at us with a little bit of a different factual feeling orientation. In using a figure, the writer often transfers the word into a field of thought where it's not at home. For example, in the sentence, "The Lord is my shepherd," the word shepherd belongs to the field of thought of animal husbandry, but it's used to apply to a spiritual being. When David says, "The mountains clapped," a verb denoting human activity is transferred to an inanimate object. This transference of a word into a foreign field of thought is one of the main ways we recognize a figure of speech. So the Bible uses over 200 kinds of figures of speech, according to Bullinger's book, Figures of Speech Used in the Bible. I would suggest to you that you get this book. If you have Logos, it's there, I think, depending on the level you have. If you don't use Logos, go out and buy the book. It's in paperback, but you'll probably want it in hardback because you'll use it so much you'll break it if it's only in paperback. But if you can get it on Logos, that's the way to go. Here's a book that will find so many figures of speech that you've never dreamed of that it will be your first place to go. As you're reading your Bible, you're looking for figures of speech, and once you've finished looking for them, then you're going to turn to Bullinger, look up the passage, and you will discover that he discovered 15 figures of speech you've never heard of or never recognized. So you do your work, then you check it against his work. You will always learn something. Very helpful tool. Though figures of speech are more common in poetry than in prose, they are found in virtually all kinds of literary forms. Since a proper interpretation of the Bible is based on what we call the literal, normal interpretation, it's important to understand how to interpret figures of speech. Quote, figurative language is not antithetical to literal interpretation, it's part of it. Perhaps it's better not to speak of figurative versus literal interpretation, but of ordinary literal versus figurative literal. Or, this is from Dr. Roy Zook, or simply realizing that sometimes language is used literally, and sometimes when it's used literally, it's literally to be taken as a literary device. So we do believe in the literal interpretation, but when we come up against a figure of speech that is obviously conveying a literary aspect, we need to recognize that that is literally a literary aspect when we interpret it. So when David says the mountains clapped, we recognize that is literally a figure of speech to communicate a literary truth. So we are literary as we are also literal. Since the Bible uses so many figures of speech, we need to recognize them and determine what they mean. So why are figures of speech used? Dr. Zook would suggest a number of reasons. One, they add color or vividness. Number two, they attract attention. The hills clapped gets your attention. They make abstract or intellectual ideas more concrete. They aid in retention. It's raining cats and dogs holds your attention. They abbreviate an idea and they encourage reflection. So on the next page, here's a list, and you can find these in a variety of books. Bullinger has these, some textbooks on hermeneutics will have these as well. But this is only a few of the plethora of figures of speech that are available. And again, I would suggest to you to get Bullinger, who will highlight many, many more than you've ever dreamed of. Some of the simple ones are like a simile. An explicit, and makes it explicit by using like or as, an explicit comparison stating the resemblance between two things of unlike nature, yet have something in common. So, he is like a tree planted by streams of water. Well, a tree and he are different. But the like a tree, that's the simile, is to help you understand what the nature of the he is. You surround them with your favor. How does he do that? As with a shield. So a person's favor isn't a shield, but it's like a shield. I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. Very poetic, very picturesque, very emotionally astute way of speaking. All men are like grass. So equating men, animate object with inanimate object, men are grass. What does that mean? That's a picturesque way of saying there's a lot of them. Well, you'll see in the context there's a lot of them, and they also burn up a lot. So there are a number of speeches that involve comparison, and then B, there are figures of speech involving substitution, where you substitute something for something else. This is called metonymy. You can read about the different ways that this is used. Synecdoche. Number 5, the substitution of one noun for another related noun to which it has some physical or generic relationship. The whole for the part or the part for the whole. Like the metonymy, synecdoche is based on relationship, not resemblance. Unlike metonymy, the substitution is not related by cause and effect, but by such generic relationships as general and specific, universal and particular, kind and example. So, the synecdoche of genus, the general for the specific, preach the gospel to every creature, specifically obviously meaning human beings, mankind. Synecdoche of species, the truth, the specific for the general. Give us today our daily bread, that's the general. which is for food, excuse me, that's specific for the food and drink. So these are ways of substituting parts for the whole or substituting concepts. On the next page, number 6, merism. This is a form of synecdoche in which the totality or whole is substituted by contrasting the opposite parts. You know when I sit up and when I rise, when I sit and when I rise. Now, does that mean he only knows us when I sit or when I rise? No, it means you know everything about me from this end to this end and everything in between. When I get up, when I go down, and everything in between, you know all activities. You know everything. Anthropomorphisms, the explicit or implicit describing of human characteristics or activities to God. Zoomorphism, the explicit or implicit describing of animal characteristics or actions to God. Under his wings, you will find refuge. God doesn't have wings. God assails me and tears me in his anger and gnashes his teeth at me. I take it God doesn't have teeth. So these are literary ways using figures of speech to transfer concepts from one world to another, one arena to another. Personification, describing of human characteristics or actions to inanimate objects or ideas to animals, like let the rivers clap their hands. Rivers don't clap hands, they don't have hands to clap. Let the mountains sing together for joy, mountains don't sing. So this is personifying. Euphemism, number 11, a substitution of an inoffensive or mild expression for an offensive or personal one. Those who have fallen asleep, we looked at this earlier. Fallen asleep is used metaphorically, euphemistically, to mean they died. Instead of saying they died, we would say they passed away, they passed on, or they fell asleep, all of which are euphemistic ways of helping to soften a harsh blow. Figures of speech involving omission or suppression. Some would say rhetorical questions are one way of doing this. Figures of speech involving overstatement or understatement, hyperbolic statements, a deliberate exaggeration. The cities are large and fortified to heaven. Does that mean they're literally built up so tall that they reach into heaven? No, but it's simply hyperbolic statement, hyperbole of what it actually is trying to say. Every night I make my bed to swim. I dissolve my couch with tears. Literally dissolve? No. Literally do I swim? No. But it's like raining cats and dogs. It's poetic language. Litotes, an understatement or a negative statement to express and emphasize a positive statement. We seemed like grasshoppers, or against such thing there is no law. I would add this, when Paul said, I come from Tarsus, a no small city. Small, negative, no, negative, but put the two together, no small, hyper positive. Or if I were to say to you, Jim, if you do this for me, I will not forget you. Not, negative, forget, negative. I will not forget you means I will really remember you. The double negative becomes a hyperpositive. And then irony. We've seen this in Luke 24 passage, expressing a thought, usually ridicule, in the form of a compliment that conveys its opposite and expecting to be understood. So, in 2 Samuel, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today. That is not meant to be positive. That's meant to be ironic. That's meant to be sarcastic. Similar to saying, wow, you're a nice person. Now that sounds negative, but if I say, wow, you're a nice person, that could be taken positively, but if you see the illocutionary force, you would hear it and see it in the negative, and it would be taken as ironic. So how do we interpret figures of speech? Zook would suggest these steps. Determine if a figure of speech is involved. So you're reading your Bible and you see what you think is a figure of speech. You're not sure, but you write it down that it is. Discover the image and the non-image of the figure of speech. What's the figure of speech figuring? What's the figure of speech speaking to? What's the figure of speech adding about what it is it's talking about? State the point of comparison. Don't assume a figure always means the same thing and place legitimate limits or controls on a figure by means of logic and communication. Final step is when you think you're done, then you pick up Bullinger and you look at Dr. Bullinger and see what you missed, so to speak. Now, so as we come to the Bible, we're doing our rhetorical analysis. We're finding out what the genre is. If it's a narrative, there are certain rules of rhetoric for that. If it's an epistle, there are certain rules of rhetoric for that. If it's poetic language, there are certain rules for rhetoric like that, especially figures of speech. If we're coming to either narrative or didactic literature, letters, that type of, or sermons, that type of thing, there are some other rhetorical devices that we want to be mindful of. So pull up your outline that's entitled Rhetorical Devices. Rhetorical devices. Introduction. Rhetoric, by definition, is art of effective persuasion. Aristotle wrote that rhetoric is the faculty of discovering in any particular case all of the available means of persuasion. Rhetorical devices are the literary structure employed by writers to enhance, clarify, or strengthen their arguments. Rhetorical devices are used by both biblical and non-biblical authors. So, as we saw in the narrative of Luke 24, that narrative included an incredible amount of rhetorical devices and techniques. The stylistic features in biblical literature are oftentimes structural and may only be evident in the original language of the text. The exegete must be aware of the presence of rhetorical devices in the text in order to obtain to full intent of the author. Remember, meaning is for the intent of the author expressed in the text. One may overemphasize or fail to understand the meaning of a text if the rhetorical device is not acknowledged. So one of the devices, one of the tools, one of the techniques that is used is a technique or a tool called chiasmus, or chiastic structuring. A rhetorical device which is used a number of times in Old and New Testament is called chiasmus. The name comes from the Greek letter chi, which resembles the St. Andrew's cross in shape. It describes the rhetorical device in which two halves of the portion under consideration are mirror images of each other. If the lines are lettered consecutively in the first half and in reverse order with the accent mark to distinguish them in the second half, then if there are four lines in the portion, the chiastic structure would be A, B, and then B, A. A prime, B prime, B, A, or A, B, B prime, A prime. If there are six lines, then the structure would be A, B, C, C, B, A. We go straight in, and then we back straight out. The second half is thus the reverse in linguistic order of the first half, and so you can look at this in Matthew 7. One way of looking at classic chiastic structure is that the center is what is the focal point. So A, B, C would then go out to B and A, or so you could have A, B, C, and then you'd have A, B or B, A, but C is the focal point in terms of the emphasis in the passage or in the section that you're studying. So what I've given you as you turn the page are a number of passages that seem to have some sort of crisscrossing chiastic structure attached to them. It goes on to page 3, and then we also have what's called the ring pattern. Longer texts, the author may repeat the chiasmus so that what appears to be construed as a long concentric or a ring pattern arrangement accompanied by two or more parallel ideas. So, I mean, it can go A, B, C, B, A. It could go A, B, C, C, B, A. It could go A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C. There are a number of ways that this can take place. Let me show you some of these in Scripture. Notice in Isaiah, keep on hearing but do not understand, keep on seeing but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull, their ears heavy, blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. So notice, lest the heart which is dull, the ears that are heavy, the eyes that are blind. He goes back to the eyes that see, the ears that hear, the heart that understands. So this is a way to help you remember what has been said. Not only the usage of anatomical items like heart, ears, and eyes, but also a description of them, dull, heavy, and blind, and then the giving them to you, then inverting and going back the other way. All of these are ways of helping you remember what the passage is saying. Or in Proverbs 26, committing important business to a fool is how it begins. How it ends, committing important business to a fool. In between, a proverb in a fool's mouth, proverb in a fool's mouth. And in the middle, honoring a fool. That is the main point. Don't honor a fool. But he puts it in a chiastic structure that we might remember it. In Proverbs 26, notice, to deliver, who abandon, and description of crooked path. He then says it again, to deliver, who abandons, the deadly path. So he's repeating with the same words, and he's repeating it in the ABC, ABC. You can see this also not just with words, but with numbers. If you look at the flood structure, the flood began 7 days after Noah. It rained for 40 days. Water prevailed 150 days. Noah opens the ark 40 days after. Noah waits 7 days. So you can see that this is driving toward the 150 and then drives back out the same way. Again, this is a way of remembering the event. 150 is kind of a key, but 7 and 40 are the repeated numbers as well. And again, some would say that 7 and 40 are fairly significant numbers, which is why some people say it's mythological or it's to be taken as spiritualized as opposed to literal. But others would say, no, it is literal. But the point for us here is this story is told with a literary device to make it memorable. If you miss the literary device, you won't perhaps catch the whole story. We look at this with the structure of the Magi. So we see the Magi and Herod, and then the biblical text speaks of the king's birth, and then Herod, and then the Magi. So we go A, B, C, and the key part is the biblical text speaking of the king's birth, and then back out to Herod, and back out to the Magi. In this we see the righteousness of God. It's righteousness by faith, not works. Faith for the Jews and Gentiles, righteous by faith, not works, righteous by faith for the Jew and Gentile. So it's A, B, A, B. Again, kind of trying to help us keep clear. In a short text, we see brethren. My Greek font didn't show up for some reason, but okay. He starts and he ends with the brethren concept. In the middle, he talks to children, the paideia, little children. So it's brethren, children, children, brethren. If we look at a very well-known passage, you'll notice in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and God, repeating, was the Word. This one was in the beginning with God. So it's an A, B, C, D, E, F, F is the key, and then it backs out, traversing the same ground that it had. So these are ways of looking at chiastic structure. Some would call this, Robert Stein calls this chiastic parallelism, and so whoever exalts himself will be humbled, whoever humbles himself will be exalted. A, B, B, A. Saves life, lose it, save it. A, B, B, A. A, B, C, C, A, B, A. So these are ways of seeing a chiastic structure. We might also look in Colossians, according to Robert Stein. We have the A, B, C, and then again A prime, B prime, C prime. Hopefully you're realizing that this is fairly prevalent in the Bible, in the Old and the New Testament Bible, and it is. The chiastic structure about the first visit to the temple, and then Jesus returns to the temple. So you got the temple visit, the cursing the tree, action in the temple, tree's dead, goes back to the temple. So it's A, B, finishes off with an A, unless you want to see more that goes further down. We can look at whole books of the Bible. This is from Richard Davidson, his understanding of Ezekiel. He would see the whole book as one giant chiastic structure with the focal point being at the top, E, judgment on the fallen cherub. if you take that as the angel, if you take that as Lucifer, and many would. So then what you have is this parallel chiastic crescendo. 1 through 11, Yahweh comes to his temple. 40 to 48, Yahweh comes to his temple. B, the oracles of judgment, more oracles of judgment and restoration. Jerusalem besieged, Jerusalem falls, oracles against the foreign nations, oracles against the foreign nations. But as we drive up from A, B, C, D, we hit the judgment on the chosen cherub, or the fallen cherub, and then back down through D, C, B, A. We end with Yahweh in his temple. Fixed point, or the focal point, is the anointed cherub. If we look at Genesis 12 to 21, David Dorsey, he has an entire book on structuralism in the Old Testament. You'll notice how he puts that together, and he would suggest that we go A, B, C, D, E, F, Ishmael's birth, but then Ishmael and Abraham circumcised, we go back out to the birth of Isaac and the promise fulfilled. So we start with the promise of descendants, we end with the birth of Isaac and the promise fulfilled. We start with the promises there, and we see how it works itself out, and finally with Ishmael's birth, we end with the conclusion of the birth of Isaac and the promise fulfilled. Also in the book of Jonah. Jonah has a very chiastically structured book in chapters 1 and 2 especially, but the hot point becomes Jonah and the sailors fear the Lord. So all of this is to kind of get us towards X marks the spot, to get them to realize, hey, you need to fear the Lord. And the sailors say, what the heck have you done? And then it backs on out, and the Lord appointed a great fish to the house of Jonah. Remember, the Lord told Jonah to go to enter Nineveh, the house of the fish. Finally, the Lord appointed a great fish to house Jonah. A little bit of irony there. One of my favorites, Proverbs 31, because this is about the godly wife, who can know, who can find. So it drives us to the key point that there's a public respect for the husband at the gate. And all of this leads to that, then backs out, and it begins high value of a good wife, high value of a good wife. I like this one because I used this to propose to my wife. There we were talking, and I said, let me read this proverb to you. And I read this proverb to her, and I said, well, and she looked back to me and said, well, what? And I looked and said, well, will you? And she said, will I what? I said, will you marry me? She said, yes. And the rest is history. So I like Proverbs 31 for a lot of reasons. Structurally, it's important, but personally, it was very, very important. So we go to a book like Daniel. I think it's highly chiastically structured. Romans 9, God's choice of Israel is seed. The bottom A, God's choice is Israel's seed. In between, we move God's love. We get to the C, or the X marks the spot, is mercy and his power to choose. Repeated again in 19 to 24, and then he backs out. We can see it in the Gospels as well. In John 13, the Upper Room Discourse, Jesus' time of departure starts it. Judas departs, ends it. The X marks the spot. Judas lifts up his foot, which is actually part of an Old Testament passage. So as you can see, there are a number of ways that you can see a chiastic structure in the passage. So what I'd like you to do is let's try a little bit. So if you would, take your Bible and turn to the book of 2 Timothy chapter 2. 2 Timothy chapter 2, and I want you to look at verses 11 through 13. Chapter 2, verse 11 through 13. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. Now, you'll notice it starts, it is a trustworthy statement. Let's just leave that one alone and suggest that's the introduction. Then you're looking at the rest of 11, all of 12, and all of 13, and I'm asking you to think about and to take a piece of paper, and I want you to take a few minutes and think through if there is, and of course you know there is, because why would I have you spend time on this after we've just gotten done talking about chiastic structure? So I want you to look and see if you can see the chiastic structural item that's there. Now you might decide there are 2 or 3 ways you could do it. That's fine. We'll look. So I want you to take 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 through 13, and look for the chiastic structuring mechanism that Paul is utilizing here in this passage, and then we'll come back together.
Please press pause while you're completing the exercise. Then you can play again when you're ready.
All right, by now I assume that you've had some opportunity to see and ask yourself the question, where exactly is there any kind of chiastic structure? Let me suggest one for you that I think might be helpful. You'll notice there's a lot of if, right? If, it's a trustworthy statement, if we died with him, we'll also live with him, if we endure, if we deny, if we are faithless. So one might think that those if clauses have some role in it or some function with it. And I would suggest perhaps that's true. If we take a look at this structure, I think we can see this. We see an ABBA structural mechanism. If we die with him, we shall live. Look at the A prime. If we're faithless, he remains faithful, which is why we shall still live. The 2 in the middle, the B and the B prime, seem to be talking about a different topic. If we endure, we shall reign with him. If we deny him, he will deny us. This is 2 words on this different topic, but these are 2 statements about eternal significance. The first and last statement are about eternal security. The first and last statement say that no matter what, I'm secure. The 2 in the middle say, I am significant if I endure. But if I don't endure and I do the opposite, I deny, then he will deny me. So 2 are about eternal security, 2 are about eternal significance. Now you say, can we validate that? Well, number 1, we're looking at the literary device that does it for us. But number 2, if we look outside of that, we go a little broader, we see that eternal security and eternal significance are topics that are covered in the book itself. So contained within 2 Timothy, he does speak about our eternal security. We're called, we're guarded, the Lord knows his own, and he has rescued us. But he also talks about eternal significance, about being approved and not ashamed, of having honor, not making progress, a crown that's awarded for faith. Demas, who's the negative illustration of not doing that, but deserting. Mark is positive, he's useful. Alexander, he's going to be rewarded for his deeds. So here we have, number 1, the literary device that seems to be in play with the chiastic structure. But secondly, we look outside of that and we say, that seems to be included in a book that covers both of those topics, which you would expect to find if the literary device is housing 2 ideas. So I think it is. So my hope is that you realize that chiastic structuring is very, very important. It helps unlock numerous things in the Bible. Another tool that we need to think about is what is called inclusio or inclusion. When an author begins and ends a section or a book with the same basic idea or concept or words, he is using a book marking apparatus. He is using an inclusio apparatus. When you watch TV and you see a story or you read a novel and the story opens up and there they were by the river brook, the 3 of them enjoying the ducks. And then you have this long 1,100-page story. And at the very end, and there they are at the river brook enjoying the lovely ducks. All of a sudden, when you read that at the end, it throws you back to the very beginning and you start remembering everything in between. That's the author's way of saying, let me remind you of how my story holds together. It's a literary device to hold it together and to cause you to be reminded and to think of the beginning once you get to the end. Well, when we come to the Bible, we see this as well. Revelation, the book of Revelation, chapter 1. These things must soon take place. The time is near. How does the book end? These things must take place. The time is near. That's an inclusio. It is meant to remind us of what took place. Also, the word soon and near are found repeatedly in the book of Revelation, which kind of pushes us forward. Or in the book of Romans, we see God's righteousness in 1:17, bracketed with God's righteousness in 3:21. Back in 2 Corinthians, we do not lose heart. We don't lose heart. That brackets the section for us. The book of Hebrews, we see he didn't subject angels concerning the world to come. At the end, he says, for he did not give help to angels. And in between, he talks about the Son of Man and the many sons who are going to rule the world of the future. So it's not to angels. It's not to angels. It's to man, the many sons, and what they're going to do. That is an inclusio to heighten the point that he's trying to emphasize. If we were to look in the Matthew 10 and 11, Matthew 10, 1 and 2 begins something to the 12 disciples. Matthew 11, 1, there is something to the 12 disciples. In between, Jesus talks in chapter 10 about you want to lose your life. If you save your life, you lose it. If you lose your life, you save it. So what we have is an inclusio wrapped around the sentence, the 12 disciples in 10:1 and 11:1, and everything else in between is all about the disciples. Now, one other illustration of the importance of these rhetorical devices, excuse me, is found in 1 Thessalonians. There's a chiastic structure that I think is very important, where he is comparing and contrasting they versus you. They will be surprised by the tribulation. They who live in darkness and are overtaken like a thief, they shall not escape. But look at the contrast. You will not be surprised. Who? Who live in light and are not overtaken by a thief in the night. Live as children of light, awake, but whether you're awake or asleep, we're not destined for wrath, as opposed to those who won't escape, you will escape. This is a very important chiastic structure because it heightens a very important theological topic. Basically, this is helping us understand that we as Christians are not destined for wrath. You would want to do a word study on the word wrath. It's the word orge. It's used in 1:9 and 10. It's used in 5:9 and 10 of 1 Thessalonians. Both places, you're not destined for wrath. And at the end, you're not destined for wrath. And in the middle, chapter 2, verse 16, it says the Jews are storing up wrath. But we're not destined for wrath. So we are here in this chiastic structure, we are contrasted with those who don't escape the wrath of the tribulation versus we who do escape the wrath of the tribulation. And hence what you actually have here is a pre-tribulational rapture text that gives us confidence that we will not endure the great tribulation. So here's a figure of speech, a chiastic structure that actually plays a very important place in our understanding of a theological doctrine. So I hope that you are beginning to see the importance of understanding rhetoric, understanding rhetorical devices, and seeing how they are so significant in our lives.